Hello and welcome to On Point. I'm Logan. Climate change is a worldwide problem that may have a dramatic effect much sooner than expected. The UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says we have 12 years to limit global warming to under 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. If people don't make changes, the Earth will experience even more extreme weather events by 2030. Cal State University Northridge students say they're aware of global warming.
I feel like if we continue to go on the route that we're going right now, it'll just change drastically. And it's going to affect everybody. No one's going to be safe from it.
Absolutely, and I'm surprised that it's that liberal of a number, actually, if that makes sense. Because I've been reading so much, I hear all sorts of different things, like we're past the point of no return and just stuff like that. So I would say, yes, it's very worrisome, but at the same time, not surprising either.
CSUN has received 4 statewide sustainability awards. The campus has separate bins for trash and recycling, solar panels, and Lime bikes to help students with transportation. These resources help motivate students to make a difference on their own.
I have a bottle. I don't buy bottles. What else? When I go to drive-thrus, I always tell them, don't give me silverware, don't give me napkins, don't give me a straw. I use my own coffee mug.
I try to do my best. I try to walk or ride my bike. I try not to drive my car too much. Try to use public transportation.
But some people still litter, trash cans are overflowing, and students drive to campus past factory smokestacks. Trash in factories aren't the only cause of rapid climate change. The meat industry also plays a big role in contributing to global warming, and some students say they've started cutting back on meat.
I don't eat a lot of meat, so I think that's one thing that I do. I will usually take a vegetarian option over a meat option. I'm not a vegetarian, but just reduce my meat consumption.
I don't want to say I've gone vegan, but I do kind of keep that in mind when I eat meat. I've been trying to cut red meat specifically, just because, not so much of the save the animals effect, but just because of that industry has just gone, I guess, out of control, really.
On Point's Leonard Tesher has more on the story.
Thank you, Nicholas. I'd like to introduce my guests. First off, we have Miles Lewis, artist and art and conservation educator. Next, we have Dr. Loraine Lundquist, faculty associate at the Institute of Sustainability.
Hi.
And lastly, we have Sean Carlin, author and blogger. Loraine, I'd like to start off with you. Can you just talk about what is climate change, and is there a difference between climate change and global warming?
No, there's not a difference between climate change and global warming, that we use these words interchangeably. When we talk about climate change, we are mostly talking about what is happening to our globe. It's getting warmer as a result of human activities, namely primarily the burning of fossil fuels.
Is climate change something that's mostly man-made, kind of like Loraine mentioned, or is it something that's just natural environmental causes?
Well, climate change has happened throughout history, far before humans. So there are 2 sort of lines that we're looking at. One is global natural climate change, which can be precipitated by many different forms of sort of natural and, natural phenomena. And then what Loraine brought up is the point of man-made or sort of man-encouraged climate change.
And going off of that a little bit, is that something that we should focus on more of how the environment is affected by people and having people kind of take care of themselves more than the environment?
Well, I think that is a huge sort of historical issue, is that many cultures around the globe have had an idea of humanity's dominion over nature, and sometimes an oppositional attitude between nature and man. Something that my colleagues here would probably bring up is the fact that environmental messaging has sometimes had a little bit of trouble because it falls on that stumbling block. When people talk about saving trees, right, or saving the environment or saving the ocean, they often think that what you're saying is that's more important than people. But I think that if we're able to see them as all of a piece, right, if we're doing things that are good for trees and the ocean and for our air quality, we're also doing things that are broadly good for people. And so I think that that is sort of a combination that we're trying to find.
Perfect.
And just to bounce off of that, when we talk about fighting this human-induced climate change that we are faced with right now, I often tell my students that, you know, the terms that people often use are things like saving the Earth, but the Earth is going to be just fine. It's really saving humanity, saving our species, and saving life as we know it, meaning our lives as we know it, and being able to maintain the kind of standard of living and the number of people that we have here on the planet, being able to sustain that population without tremendous suffering. That's what we're trying to do, as opposed to even more so than saving the Earth.
Yeah, it really ends up being a human-focused project.
Yeah, because the term, you know, when you think about it in those terms, like saving the Earth, what you're essentially doing is you're putting, once again, humanity in the position of being the kind of having dominion over the Earth, which really isn't the case. It's, you know, it's a complex ecosystem. And the Earth's going to be fine with or without us. So it's sort of about coming back to a place of humility where we realize we impact the Earth as we live on it and as we burn fossil fuels. But maybe looking at it from the perspective of saving it is, again, it's born of the same arrogance that kind of got us into this mess in the first place.
And that's kind of where we're headed to next. Just recently, the UN released a report saying that we have roughly 12 years until we're kind of going to reach catastrophic situations. And Sean, is that something that we can stop or halt the process on, or is it too late to go back now?
No, there's very much time. I mean, as dire as the IPCC report was, what it's basically saying is we do have a very narrow window now to get a handle on climate change, to kind of drastically curb our emissions. And what that'll do is that buys us time. That buys us time to kind of develop technologies. Well, we have carbon sequestration technologies. They're just not very cost effective right now. But it'll buy us time to develop viable technologies that can help pull some of the carbon currently in the air, that's going to be in the air for quite some time, centuries if not longer, and get it out. So yeah, the next 12 years are absolutely critical. And these are action years. People shouldn't sort of fall into despair. I've heard people say, well, it's going to be so bad by the year 2100 and there's nothing we can do about it anyway, so let's not even bother. No, we've been told, in a sense we've been given a gift by this report. We've been told we have a finite window to get our act together. So now it's time, and we've done it before. I mean, the civil rights movement and marriage equality, these were all things that took forever until we got mobilized, and then we got them done in short order. So Al Gore talks about a sustainability revolution, and that's what we need right now, and that's what the next 12 years are going to be about. It's going to be about a revolution on the magnitude of the Industrial Revolution, but with the speed of the digital revolution.
Yeah, and to paraphrase that too, I think that really it's important to recognize it as a huge opportunity, because the way that we've been living, that perhaps hasn't immediately precipitated what we expect to be happening through climate change into the next few decades and centuries. But the way that we were living, in the 50s, you'll see photos of, of cops and just people in general wearing gas masks in Los Angeles because of how poor the air quality was. There were thousands of people who died in the 1950s as well in the UK when you had this toxic cloud descend on the city, right? The way that we have been running our economy has had a lot of collateral damage. And so much of the opportunity here is that all of these changes that we could be making are going to be broadly better for human health in addition to so many other metrics. So it's a wonderful sort of revision opportunity.
Yeah, it's about creating a kind of a new way of living, a new philosophy of living for the 21st century, because all roads lead back to climate change. The healthcare crisis, economic inequality, social justice, they're all kind of tied into this umbrella of climate change. So there is going to be an opportunity for a systemic restructuring of society as we know it. And that's the thing that the IPCC report is telling us really has to happen in short order, in about 12 years, give or take.
Loraine, any thoughts on the article?
Well, absolutely, I agree with both of my colleagues here. And the thing about this report is that it doesn't sound, in our current political climate, like it's politically possible. But it is definitely possible in terms, technologically speaking, it is absolutely possible. Economically speaking, it is absolutely possible. In fact, it will likely save us tremendous amounts of money if we do this. Politically, it's hard to imagine. How can this happen in 12 years, given where we are right now, politically speaking? But I think that humanity is capable of remarkable things. If you look in our history, for example, if you had predicted in 1938, before World War II, both in terms of the suffering and in terms of how much our country was going to gather together to face this incredible threat. Both of those, if you had said that there were going to be millions of people that died in gas chambers and all that suffering that did occur in World War II, you would have been thought crazy. But you also would have been thought crazy to think that we would then come together and we would change our entire industry over, right? We would tell the car manufacturers that you're going to stop manufacturing cars and you're going to put all of your efforts toward the war effort. And we would tell people that every single person is going to have a victory garden in their backyard to support the war effort, and that the entire workforce of women is going to come out and work in the factories to support the war effort. All of that you would have sounded like a crazy person, right? But we did all that, and we came together to face this threat, and we overcame this threat. And I think that humanity is capable of great things once the threat is really recognized. And so I do believe we're going to come together, and that it will at some point shift into a massive effort where everyone works together.
And I think that some of what we are doing here in presenting this in this format is just sensitizing everybody, right? Because we don't expect everybody to become an activist or an advocate. We don't expect everybody to radically change how they live their lives immediately, but we want everybody to be aware of what could be coming down the road, so that when they have to make a switch, it is far easier and far more holistic with the larger community that they'll be working with.
And kind of going off the political take of it, we've had leaders as high up as President Trump and many others say they don't believe in climate change, it's not something that's real. Miles, what do you say to those naysayers?
I think that they know it's real. I think it's more, there are a few lines on which people kind of argue that, right? So I hear a lot of conservative pundits say climate change is real, but it's not our primary focus and shouldn't be our primary focus. And then there are a lot of people who say, well, these environmentalists are saying that now we have to live like it's in the 1850s, we have to sort of deconstruct our entire industry. So I think that that it's just going to be too expensive in order to electrify like we need to do, or implement renewable energy at the scale that we need to. So I think that's really what President Trump is saying, and others are. They know that climate change is a thing. All companies in the world know that climate change is a thing. ExxonMobil knows that climate change is a thing. So I think that the larger argument that hopefully catches a lot of people who are used to denying climate change currently because it is an inconvenient truth. I mean, that's part of why Al Gore called it an inconvenient truth, is showing how economically feasible and also advantageous it can be, like Loraine brought up, right? So solar and wind are now lower cost sort of energy sources than a lot of fossil fuels that we use, or I think all fossil fuels that we're currently using. And so that can occur in a number of sectors that will both green the economy and also make a huge amount of wealth. I think once that seems to be proven, then the number of conservatives, let's say that American conservatism tends to kind of sit in this sort of general denial or sort of fudging around climate change. Hopefully those conservatives who understand, and those political leaders who understand that climate change is a thing but who don't have it as a focus now, will kind of easily be able to incorporate it into their messaging as it's shown to be a huge economic benefit. That is our response to it, is shown to be a huge economic benefit.
And to roll with that, I think even more so than liberals, I think actually particularly conservative pundits and think tanks fully understand what we were talking about a few minutes ago, which is that to really address this issue, especially given how dire it is and given the narrow window of time we have, it is going to require a major systemic restructuring of capitalism and neoliberalism and the kind of policies and the economic philosophies of the 20th century. That's what they're trying to hold on to. They don't want to get rid of that because that benefits very few at the expense of the many. And the world we could be headed into, if we make the right choices over the next 12 years, will be ultimately a more fair and just and equitable world for everyone. And the people with their hands on the levers of power right now have an interest in keeping that from happening.
Loraine?
I think there's a difference between the people in power who are, finding any argument that they can find to try to deny climate change essentially because of a profit motive or because their donors have a profit motive. The fossil fuel companies have an enormous amount of reserves of oil, for example, that are built into their stock price already, and to admit what we have to do in order to fix climate change is to walk away from, it was actually estimated to be $20 trillion in total. If you look at all of the fossil fuel companies in the world, that's how much money that those companies and state-owned corporations would have to walk away from in order to keep the amount of fossil fuels in the ground. And that's just the fossil fuels that are already claimed and already essentially factored into the stock prices of these companies. So there's an enormous incentive for them to not believe it or say they don't believe it, or to what they're basically doing is trying to encourage doubt in the minds of the general population about the science, right? So that they can have some more time to extract profit from what they already have. Individuals, on the other hand, there are individuals, I think, who have been responding to this propagation of doubt, who, maybe they don't believe it because of sort of a tribal identity kind of thing, right? You believe the people that you think, the people that you trust and the people that share the same values as you and share the same political views as you. So that might be part of it. But I think there's also this sense of there's a guilt and there's a sense of violating your identity. So, if I am a person who is really proud of, the money that I've made and the nice big suburban house that I've been able to buy for my family and my nice SUV car and all of that stuff, the notion that I am personally responsible for creating a world of suffering for my children because of these things that I thought I was doing for my children, that's a really painful and guilt-inducing reality to accept, and it really goes against people's it incites these sort of natural defense mechanisms so that you want to not believe it. So I think that's part of what's happening on an individual level.
It's hard to imagine, certainly like you look at the baby boomers, it's hard to imagine some of the philosophies, like for example, capitalism, that they spent their whole life adhering to and living within that framework. And it's hard to I wouldn't at 70 years old be able to say, oh God, that was a lie. I mean, that's sort of left the world worse off, not better off. And I think it's not hard to imagine retreating into a shell of denialism over just the intractability of that and the guilt that comes from it.
I mean, in this, do you mean capitalism specifically, or do you mean consumerism?
Yeah, the consumerism and the kind of extractive capitalism, the idea of kind of just extracting value out of things and then moving on.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I think a consistent argument that you get, and again, to that point that I think that a lot of people will sort of move in this direction. A lot of companies seem to be showing, shifts towards a much greener form of capitalism, because capital, again, is not the issue, right? It's not so much money, which is an abstract thing, which can have an environmental impact or not. It really has more to do with how capital interacts with the material economy, right? The goods that we're using.
Extractivism.
Right, and
Yeah.
so I think one of the issues that I see when talking with people about this, especially those who are not really sympathetic to environmental, to sort of adjusting society according to environmental standards, is the idea that, I think most everybody who has a few generations in America or who's a recent immigrant really feels that the capitalist system that we've had in America has delivered tremendous good. And I think it's difficult for a lot of us to argue it, given that, I think a lot of the people in this room have experienced tremendous good in terms of just sort of quality of life. So I think that's why I brought up the distinction between capitalism and consumerism. Sort of marking that distinction between capital and consumption, I think, is really important, because it can get into these older arguments that I think are fairly obsolete. The sort of earlier 20th century arguments about, socialism versus capitalism. You brought up the idea of World War II, right? Even though when we were operating at the level that we were operating under in World War II, it was almost a kind of statism, right? The state was telling everybody what to do in order to accomplish this heroic task. We don't remember it as such. We don't remember it as practically a communist community that we developed in order to fight the Nazis. And then we very quickly turned into a military-industrial complex, like Eisenhower discussed. And so I think that, really finding how to sort of cut between those different terms and communicating with people, I found to be very important.
And speaking on kind of communicating a little bit, climate change isn't really something that's covered all too much by the media. It's kind of swept under the rug a little bit. Sean, would you like to talk about why that is?
Yeah, it's funny. Al Gore once described the media's relationship with climate change. It's sort of like their advertisers are sort of like the alcoholic father in a dysfunctional family, and every time you bring up the word alcohol, he goes berserk, so everybody just kind of walks around it. Yeah, that's been a huge problem. I mean, there's a great website, which I encourage everybody to go to, called endclimatesilence.org, which is all about pressuring the mainstream media to start drawing lines between these massive superstorms we have and the climate crisis. But right now, it hasn't been something that's been kind of discussed very openly. I mean, I think the statistic is fewer than 1 in 5 people even know someone who brings up the subject of climate change with them in a given month. So that right now is the big, in my mind, it's one of the big things that's got to get done if we're going to capitalize on this 12-year window we've been given, is getting people talking about it and getting people understanding that it's a problem. Because something like 73% of the country believes it's a problem, believes it's something that should be addressed probably on a governmental level, but they don't know much about it. They don't know the basic science behind it, and they don't know what they can do. So yeah, the media would play a huge role right now by stepping up and just talking about it. I mean, if it came up even once a night on the nightly news, it wouldn't be that thing, oh yeah, climate change, I remember that. It wouldn't be that anymore. It would be something that was in your face every night, right before dinner, maybe even give you something to talk about over dinner. And then, and that would, I would hope, galvanize more public support for policies that are going to address this issue in the time frame we have, and at the magnitude it needs to be addressed.
It is the biggest story of our time, without question, and yet it isn't covered on the media, mostly because it doesn't get good ratings. And the reason it doesn't get good ratings is because most of us are uncomfortable thinking about it. It's so big, it's so scary, and not only that, we are implicated in it. And so it's just so much easier to not think about it. And people don't want to think about it. They turn the channel when it is talked about. I do think we all have a responsibility to ask our media stations to cover it more, to make ourselves look at it. But it's, in this system that we live in where ratings dominate, it's very hard to get traction.
Yeah, and I think being able, this happens with, you were bringing up sort of social justice issues earlier, people don't like to talk about something until people start uncomfortably talking about it. And then once there's some momentum that people can identify with, like we've seen this with queer people, gay people, and transgender people in the media, where nobody talked about it. You know, I happen to be gay, and you know, gay men of, you know, a generation or two older than I, they didn't see any representation whatsoever in any form of media, even though people knew that homosexuality was something that happened and it has existed forever, and that people might be being treated badly. I mean, there was also a lot more sort of, I don't think people have, there is a sort of cultural, you know, defense around climate change now, but it's not the same thing as, say, racism or homophobia, particularly. But now you hear about it a lot, because even in a bipartisan fashion, people feel positive about now accepting people for being gay or for being transgender or for accepting gay marriage. So it's almost a feel-good story now, rather than something creepy, scary, you know, perhaps a threat to your children, and then suddenly this rights struggle, which is kind of what we're talking about now. We're talking about sort of environmental rights as kind of a broad-based issue. So I think that, like we were discussing earlier, once there are some serious economic shifts, like you hear about it, not so much with climate change specifically, but you'll hear about like electrification of vehicles. You'll hear about, say, plant-based food options, you know, eating without animal products, you know, and people they can be defensive about that, but it isn't totalistic, right? It isn't either you do this or the world ends, right? So I think that, or our world ends in some sense. And so I think that, as far as I can tell from the media right now, that seems to be where a lot of the interest is. These small stories about sort of single-use plastics, plant-based eating and innovation around that, electrification of vehicles, Tesla, Elon Musk, people like, you know, they end up being a lot in the news. And they all implicate climate change as sort of the larger topic that's being addressed. And so hopefully that ends up getting people identifying with a way of being and a change in industry that we can sort of feel proud of. And then we can say, well, because we're doing this, we are actually tackling climate change by doing it. And then climate change can become an active, easily identifiable, even at some point, hopefully, a feel-good story. So that's my sense of it.
Miles, Loraine, Sean, I'd like to thank you all for coming on the show today.
Yeah.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Logan.
you.
Thank you.
People think I'm trash, but they're wrong. Today I'm just an aluminum can, but one day I could be a stadium.
If you would like to know more on how to prevent climate change, you can visit endclimatesilence.org. Thank you for watching On Point. You can follow us on social media at CSUN On Point. You can hear us on KCSN 88.5 FM on Sunday mornings at 5:30. You can watch us on Santa Clarita Valley Television on Sundays at 5 and on LA 36 at 9:30 Thursday evenings. For all of us here at On Point, I'm Nicholas Logan.